The betrayal was no longer whispered behind closed doors. It was paraded under chandeliers. The annual Devereux Foundation Gala was meant to celebrate legacy and philanthropy, but that year it became the stage of Isabella's deepest humiliation. The night began like any other spectacle of wealth. The ballroom glittered with crystal and gold, orchestras played soft waltzes, and reporters jostled at the velvet ropes to capture every entrance. Guests expected to see Adrian arrive with his wife on his arm, the power couple they had once admired. Instead, gasps rippled through the crowd as he stepped out of his black Rolls-Royce, hand intertwined with Vanessa's, her crimson gown clinging like a declaration of war. Inside, the betrayal unfolded in real time. Adrian introduced Vanessa as if she were royalty, pulling her closer for photographs, whispering into her ear with a smile that once belonged to Isabella. Cameras flashed, recording every embrace, every lingering glance. Vanessa reveled in it, flashing her diamond bracelet, paid for with Devereux money, while her lips curved in a smirk meant for the absent wife. "Where's Isabella?" one reporter shouted. Adrian chuckled, loud enough for microphones. "Resting, as she always does. This is my real partner now." The words spread across the room like fire. Guests shifted uncomfortably, some scandalized, others secretly entertained. No one dared confront him, not yet. But humiliation is sharpest when it is unexpected. Halfway through the evening, Isabella arrived. Her limousine pulled up quietly, but her presence was thunder. The crowd parted as she entered, her pregnant figure wrapped in midnight silk, diamonds glittering on her throat. For a moment, silence reigned, and then whispers erupted. The woman Adrian had dismissed as invisible was suddenly undeniable. Adrian's face stiffened. Vanessa tightened her grip on his arm, whispering through clenched teeth, "Ignore her. She can't touch us." But Isabella didn't need to speak. Her mere arrival shifted the room's allegiance. Guests who had laughed at Adrian's jokes now avoided his eyes, waiting for the explosion. The betrayal reached its peak when Adrian, in a fit of arrogance, chose to double down. He raised his glass and declared, "A man deserves happiness, and I've found mine." His hand lifted Vanessa's for the cameras. Isabella stood frozen, her hand resting protectively on her belly, her face composed but pale. Inside, the pain cut deeper than any knife. The orchestra faltered, the music stumbling as if the strings themselves recoiled. A waiter dropped a tray, the crash echoing like punctuation. The humiliation was complete. Adrian had chosen his mistress over his wife, publicly, defiantly, and without shame. But what Adrian believed was his triumph was in truth the beginning of his unraveling. For every flashbulb that captured his betrayal also captured Isabella's dignity. Her silence in that moment was not weakness, it was memory. She memorized every smirk, every cruel word, every indulgent laugh, and she stored it all, not as wounds but as weapons. The public betrayal was the darkest chapter of her marriage. Yet it also planted the seed of Adrian's downfall. Because in a world of wealth, appearances are everything. And Adrian had just exposed himself as a man who discarded his pregnant wife for a mistress in front of the very society that built his throne. The limousine ride home was a blur of camera flashes and muffled whispers. Isabella sat in silence, her hand pressed against her swollen belly, the baby shifting as though sensing her pain. The night's humiliation replayed in her mind on a loop. Adrian's smirk, Vanessa's mocking laughter, the pity in the eyes of strangers. Every memory burned like acid. By the time the car pulled into the Devereux mansion, Isabella's composure had cracked. She stumbled into the marble foyer, her heels clattering against the floor, and finally let herself collapse onto the velvet couch. The tears came, hot and unrelenting. For years she had carried the weight of loyalty, the burden of silence. Now it felt as if the dam inside her had burst. Her reflection in the gilded mirror across the hall startled her. The woman staring back was not the radiant heiress she had once been, nor the doting wife she had tried to be. She saw swollen eyes, trembling lips, and a body her husband called disgusting. For the first time, she whispered the words aloud. "Maybe he's right. Maybe I am nothing." The staff tiptoed around her grief. One maid dared to place a blanket over her shoulders, but Isabella shrugged it off, ashamed to be seen so broken. Hours passed in the quiet mansion, interrupted only by her sobs and the ticking of the antique clock. She cried until her body ached, until her unborn child stirred in protest, reminding her that she was not entirely alone. The collapse deepened when news outlets began broadcasting Adrian's betrayal in real time. The television in the corner flickered with images of him raising Vanessa's hand in a toast. Headlines screamed, "Adrian Blackwell chooses Mistress over Heiress wife." Her phone buzzed with endless messages, some sympathetic, others cruel, most from people who had once called themselves friends but now hungered for gossip. Isabella turned the phone face down, unable to endure another headline. In that moment, she believed she had lost everything. Her husband, her dignity, her place in society. The isolation wrapped around her like chains. Even her family's silence cut deep. Though she knew they were strategizing, in her fragile state it felt like abandonment. Her collapse reached its lowest point when she wandered into the nursery next door. The crib was unfinished, the walls half-painted in soft cream, a mobile of silver stars dangling above. She sank into the rocking chair, cradling her belly, whispering to the child within. "I don't know if I'm strong enough. I don't know if I can protect you." Her tears dripped onto her dress, staining the silk like shadows of doubt. For the first time in her life, Isabella Devereux, heiress, scholar, daughter of an empire, felt powerless. And yet, it was in that powerlessness that something dangerous began to stir. As dawn broke over the Hudson River, painting the sky with fire, a flicker of resolve rose through the ashes of her grief. Her collapse was necessary. It stripped her of illusions, burned away the lies she had told herself about Adrian, about love, about sacrifice. The woman who had broken down in the nursery chair was not the one who would rise. Because sometimes you must shatter completely before you can rebuild into something unbreakable. Grief has a strange way of sharpening the senses. For days after the gala, Isabella drifted between despair and silence, but as the humiliation settled into her bones, she began to notice details she had once ignored. Documents Adrian left behind, whispers from servants, even the sharp glance her brother Alexander gave during family meetings. It was as if the world had been screaming the truth at her for years, and only now, broken and raw, could she finally hear it. One evening, while wandering through Adrian's private study, Isabella found the first clue. A drawer left ajar revealed a folder of contracts, hastily shoved beneath expense reports. Her hands trembled as she pulled it free. The pages were dense with numbers, but Isabella was no stranger to financial language. She had studied economics long before Adrian convinced her to step back. What she saw was clear. Millions transferred from Devereux accounts into shell corporations, all linked to offshore banks. And worse, several payments matched dates when Vanessa had flaunted new jewelry and cars. Her chest tightened. This wasn't just betrayal of love. It was theft. Against her family, against her legacy, against her unborn child. The following morning, she carried the folder into the east wing of the mansion, where Alexander was in a meeting. Without a word, she placed it before him. His eyes scanned the documents, and for the first time in years, his expression softened. "I warned you about him," he said quietly. "But this is bigger than adultery. This is criminal." Still, Alexander urged caution. "If we move too soon, the scandal will explode. You're pregnant, Isabella. You can't be dragged into courtrooms and interrogations." But Isabella shook her head, her voice steadier than she expected. "He's humiliated me in public. He thinks I am weak. If I remain silent, I am complicit. I will not raise my child under the shadow of his corruption." The twist deepened when Isabella sought out the loyalty of those Adrian had underestimated. A maid confided that she had once seen Vanessa signing papers late at night in Adrian's office. A driver admitted he had dropped envelopes at unmarked buildings. Even Adrian's junior accountant, dismissed for incompetence, reached out with a USB drive filled with incriminating emails. One by one, the puzzle pieces aligned, forming a portrait of greed and arrogance so vast it shocked even Isabella. Every new revelation fueled her transformation. The pain of betrayal turned into clarity. Adrian had not simply mocked her, he had used her, siphoning her family's fortune while discarding her like a burden. Vanessa was not just a mistress, she was an accomplice, knowingly benefiting from stolen wealth. By the end of the week, Isabella sat in her childhood study surrounded by folders, drives, and sworn statements. For the first time since the gala, she felt something resembling control. She placed a protective hand over her belly, whispering, "They thought they could erase me. Instead, they handed me the weapon that will destroy them." What Adrian believed was his greatest triumph. The night he replaced his wife with a mistress had unknowingly set the stage for his collapse. In humiliating Isabella, he had awakened not just her pride but her power. And now, armed with secrets he thought buried, Isabella was ready to strike. Transformation does not happen in a single moment. It is built slowly, like dawn breaking after a long night. For Isabella, the night after discovering Adrian's crimes marked the end of who she once was. She had collapsed, she had cried, she had questioned her worth. But now, as she stood in front of the mirror in her childhood bedroom, something inside her shifted. She studied her reflection, the same body Adrian had ridiculed. Her cheeks were rounder, her figure softened by pregnancy, but her eyes, those eyes glowed with an intensity she had nearly forgotten. She traced the outline of her belly, whispering, "I am not weak. I am carrying the future." It was not just a child she carried. It was the continuation of the Devereux legacy, the bloodline Adrian could never corrupt. Her first step toward transformation was reclaiming her appearance, not for vanity, but for armor. She summoned her family's private stylist, someone she hadn't spoken to in years. When the woman arrived with racks of gowns, Isabella refused the tight, glittering dresses Vanessa adored. Instead, she chose silhouettes that celebrated her pregnancy, flowing fabrics that framed her as both powerful and maternal. She insisted on bold colors, deep emerald, commanding navy, and royal burgundy. When she stepped out in her new attire, staff members gasped. She was no longer the invisible wife. She was a queen in waiting. But clothing was only the surface. Isabella also returned to the mind she had silenced for years. In the mansion's library, she opened dusty binders of financial reports, legal case studies, and market analysis. Nights once spent crying now stretched into hours of study. She called on old professors, lawyers, and economists she had once debated with. They answered eagerly, reminded of the brilliance she had buried beneath domestic life. One even remarked, "You should have been running the empire all along." Slowly, her posture changed. She no longer hunched in shame. She walked the halls of the mansion with a new stride, servants noticing the fire in her voice. When Alexander saw her entering the East Wing boardroom uninvited, he raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He understood. His cousin was no longer a passive bystander. Her transformation also required resilience. Pregnancy was not easy. Her back ached, her body swelled, and exhaustion threatened to pull her down. But every kick from her unborn child reminded her of why she fought. Each time doubt whispered, she pressed a hand to her belly and said, "I am enough. We are enough." News outlets, hungry for drama, expected Isabella to disappear after Adrian's public betrayal. Instead, whispers began to spread. She had been seen visiting law firms, hosting quiet luncheons with investors, and stepping out in commanding gowns. Social media flipped, hashtags shifting from pity to admiration. The return of the heiress, strength and silk, pregnant and powerful. By the end of the month, Isabella stood before the mirror once more. The tears were gone, replaced by a calm determination. Adrian had mocked her as the fat woman. Vanessa had treated her as invisible. But they had underestimated the most dangerous weapon of all, a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to protect. The rebirth of Isabella Devereux was complete, and the world that had pitied her was about to witness her rise. The next public event was not just another gala. It was war disguised as elegance. The Blackwell Corporation had arranged a lavish charity dinner to display Adrian's power, with Vanessa paraded as his partner. Adrian believed it would cement his new image, burying Isabella's humiliation under a flood of flashing cameras and polished speeches. He had no idea the night would belong not to him, but to the woman he had discarded. The ballroom glittered again, but this time, anticipation hummed beneath the chandeliers. Whispers filled the air. Would Isabella dare to appear after the scandal? Adrian strutted in, Vanessa shimmering beside him in a gown deliberately provocative, her arm hooked through his. The photographers swarmed, their flashes feeding his ego. "She won't come," Vanessa murmured, smug. Adrian smirked. "She doesn't have the strength." But at the stroke of 9, the doors opened and every head turned. Isabella entered on Alexander's arm, radiant in an emerald gown that flowed around her pregnant frame like liquid royalty. She was no longer the broken woman from weeks ago. She carried herself with the poise of her ancestors, chin lifted, eyes steady, The murmurs turned into applause, not for Adrian, not for Vanessa, but for her. Adrian's jaw tightened, his grip on Vanessa faltering. The cameras swiveled instantly, flooding Isabella with light. Reporters shouted her name, investors craned their necks, and suddenly, the mistress at his side looked like a footnote. Isabella crossed the floor with unhurried grace, every step a silent declaration. I am not defeated. I am inevitable. The confrontation began subtly. Adrian approached with a forced smile, whispering through gritted teeth. You shouldn't be here. Isabella's lips curved into the faintest smile. This is my family's event. You shouldn't be here. Her words, delivered softly, cut sharper than any shout. Vanessa attempted to interject, tossing her hair. You think anyone cares about you now? Look at him, he chose me. But before she could finish, Isabella turned to her fully, eyes like steel. Chosen or bought? Because from where I stand, every diamond on you is paid for with stolen money. The crowd gasped. Flashbulbs exploded. Adrian tried to laugh it off, raising his glass. She's bitter, can you blame her? Look at what she's become. He gestured at her stomach, his cruelty laid bare. But Isabella did not flinch. She placed a steady hand over her belly and said, loud enough for the nearest reporters to hear, what I've become is a mother. What you've become is a thief. The words struck like thunder. Guests exchanged shocked glances, the tension so thick even the orchestra faltered. For the first time, Adrian felt the ground shift beneath him. His charm, his arrogance, his mistress, none of it shielded him from the undeniable power of a woman who refused to break. The confrontation ended not with shouting, but with silence. Adrian and Vanessa stood frozen, their smug facade cracked. Isabella turned, her gown trailing like a banner, and walked away with Alexander at her side. The cameras followed her, ignoring the pair she left behind. That night, the headlines didn't read about Adrian's triumph. They screamed about Isabella's return. Heiress strikes back, pregnant wife humiliates billionaire husband and mistress, and the most brutal, the real Mrs. Blackwell. Adrian had wanted a coronation. Instead, he had been dethroned in front of the very society that once cheered his rise. Adrian Blackwell had always thrived on control. Control over the boardroom, over the press, over the women who entered and exited his life. But after Isabella's return and the confrontation at the gala, that control began to unravel thread by thread. What he thought would be another night of triumph became the seed of his undoing. The next morning, the newspapers told the story in black and white. Heiress strikes back splashed across the front pages, while glossy spreads compared Isabella's radiant entrance to Vanessa's shallow smirk. Talk shows dissected the footage, hosts marveling at Isabella's composure and condemning Adrian's cruelty. Social media trended with hashtags mocking him. Thief in a tux, Vanessa the vulture, Team Isabella. At first, Adrian laughed it off. Scandals blow over, he told Vanessa, while sipping whiskey in his penthouse. They always do. But beneath his bravado, unease festered. His phone rang incessantly with investors demanding reassurance, board members requesting explanations, and lawyers warning about potential audits. His smirk grew thinner each hour. By the third day, cracks appeared in his empire. A charity sponsor pulled funding, citing reputational concerns. Stock prices dipped after a journalist unearthed whispers of financial irregularities. For years, Adrian had buried his shady dealings beneath charm and influence. But now, every critic smelled blood in the water, and the scent of scandal invited sharks. At home, the breakdown seeped into his relationship with Vanessa. She had once adored the limelight, but now the glare was unbearable. Paparazzi swarmed her every move, shouting cruel questions. How does it feel to ruin a pregnant woman's marriage? Did you know about the stolen money? Vanessa's smile faltered, her nerves fraying. She snapped at Adrian. You promised me security, you promised me respect. All I see are vultures. Adrian slammed his glass down, shards scattering across the marble counter. Do you think I built all this to lose it to her? Isabella is nothing without her family name. But even as he shouted, he knew the lie in his words. Isabella had proven she was far from nothing. She was the very force pulling his empire apart. In private, Adrian began unraveling. He stayed awake through the night, pacing his office, muttering strategies that contradicted themselves. He lashed out at employees, firing loyal staff in paranoid fits. He drank more heavily, his once polished speeches turning into slurred rants. The man who once charmed senators now frightened his own advisors. The true breaking point came in the boardroom. During a crucial meeting, Adrian attempted to deliver his usual grand performance, dismissing Isabella's words as emotional theatrics. But midway, Alexander Devereux entered unannounced, carrying a slim folder. He didn't need to raise his voice. He simply laid down documents showing preliminary evidence of Adrian's financial misconduct. "This is only the beginning," Alexander said coldly. "Withdraw gracefully, or face what's coming." Adrian laughed too loudly, sweat beading at his temples. He waved the papers away, insisting they meant nothing. But the board members exchanged wary glances. For the first time, Adrian's charm no longer held them. That evening, alone in his penthouse, Adrian stared out at the New York skyline. His reflection in the glass looked hollow, desperate. He whispered to himself, as if repeating a mantra, "I'm still in control. I'm still in control." But deep down, he knew control was slipping through his fingers, and the fortress he had built on betrayal was beginning to crumble. For weeks, Vanessa Lee had basked in the glow of stolen spotlight. She wore the diamonds Adrian gifted her like trophies, strutted through galas as if she had earned her place, and mocked Isabella in hushed corners with friends eager to sip scandal. But fame born of betrayal is fragile, and Vanessa was about to learn how quickly it shatters. The confrontation at the gala had changed everything. Photos of Isabella in emerald silk had flooded the internet, her strength praised, while Vanessa's presence drew disgust. Hashtags like Vanessa the Vulture and Mistress in Crimson trended relentlessly. Strangers attacked her on social media. Brands she once modeled for severed contracts overnight, and even clubs where she'd once been welcomed now refused her entry. At first she dismissed it with laughter. "They're jealous," she told Adrian, swirling champagne in his penthouse. "They wish they were me." But beneath the false bravado, panic gnawed at her. When she stepped outside the next morning, paparazzi swarmed, not with admiration but venom. "Vanessa, do you feel guilty about humiliating a pregnant woman? Are you wearing stolen money right now? Do you know Adrian used Devereux funds to keep you?" Their questions stabbed sharper than any knife. She shoved past them, her face plastered across headlines by evening. "Mistress turns villain overnight." The fallout grew worse when Vanessa attempted to attend a luxury fashion event. The organizers, fearing backlash, revoked her invitation at the door. Cameras caught the moment she was turned away, her painted smile crumbling into rage. The clip went viral, replayed millions of times with mocking captions, from red carpet to sidewalk. Behind closed doors, Vanessa lashed out at Adrian. "You promised me security. You promised I'd never be humiliated again." But Adrian, already spiraling, barked back, "You wanted the spotlight, now burn in it." Their partnership, once fueled by desire and greed, cracked under pressure. The true blow came when investigators began circling Adrian's financial records. One subpoena exposed payments made directly into Vanessa's accounts, extravagant transfers labeled as consulting fees. The revelation hit tabloids instantly. Overnight, she wasn't just a mistress, she was an accomplice. Reporters swarmed her apartment, cameras capturing her as she screamed at photographers from her balcony. Her so-called friends vanished, unwilling to associate with scandal. Invitations dried up. Modeling agencies blacklisted her name. And in the span of days, Vanessa went from darling of the nightlife to a pariah. One evening, desperate and cornered, she returned to Adrian's penthouse. Her makeup streaked from tears, her dress wrinkled, she clutched at him like a drowning woman. "We have to fight back," she pleaded. "You have to protect me." But Adrian, pacing with whiskey in hand, barely looked at her. "Protect you? I can't even protect myself. You're just another liability." His words sliced deeper than the jeers outside. For the first time, Vanessa felt what Isabella must have felt: discarded, humiliated, powerless. But unlike Isabella, Vanessa had no legacy, no allies, no strength to rise. She had chosen betrayal as her currency, and now its value had collapsed. That night, Vanessa stared into her mirror, the diamonds Adrian once draped around her neck scattered on the counter. For the first time, she saw not glamour, but ruin. The mistress who thought she had won now realized she had already lost. While Adrian raged and Vanessa crumbled, Isabella moved like a shadow through the corridors of power. She did not shout, she did not boast, and she certainly did not give interviews to the tabloids. Instead, she embraced silence, letting the world underestimate her while she prepared the sharpest strike of all, calculated, precise, and devastating. Her days began in the library of the Devereux mansion, stacks of documents and laptops surrounding her. With Alexander's quiet support, Isabella dissected every folder she had uncovered from Adrian's office. Offshore accounts, forged contracts, falsified expense reports, each paper trail told the story of greed. Her nights stretched into dawn as she cross-referenced files with whispers from loyal staff and the accountant who had turned whistleblower. To outsiders, Isabella appeared to be simply resting during pregnancy. Reporters who camped outside the mansion saw only the curtains drawn and assumed she was too fragile to face the scandal. What they didn't know was that behind those curtains, Isabella was orchestrating a silent war. She began building a coalition of allies Adrian had long dismissed. Former employees who had been fired unfairly, investors Adrian had cheated, even journalists Adrian had once tried to bribe. One by one, they joined her cause, offering information, connections, and platforms. Isabella never promised revenge. She promised truth. And truth, in her hands, became a weapon sharper than any dagger. Her family's legal team, once skeptical of her involvement, soon realized her brilliance. In closed-door meetings, she asked pointed questions no one expected from the naive wife. If this shell company is registered in Panama, why are funds routed through Zurich? Who signed this contract and was the signature verified? Lawyers exchanged astonished looks. Alexander leaned back with the faintest smirk. "I told you," he murmured to the team. "She's more dangerous than he ever was." Isabella also mastered timing. She refused to unleash all her evidence at once. Instead, she allowed the press to nibble on small leaks, rumors of suspicious transfers, whispers of Vanessa's consulting fees. Each headline weakened Adrian's defenses, softened public sympathy, and primed society for the revelations still to come. In her silence, Isabella also tended to her unborn child, balancing war with motherhood. Between meetings and strategy sessions, she walked the gardens, hand on her belly, whispering, "I'm fighting for us." The duality of her life, warrior by day, mother by night, gave her strength no scandal could break. The world thought Isabella was licking her wounds. Adrian scoffed to his shrinking circle of allies. "She's hiding, too humiliated to act." Vanessa sneered from her crumbling apartment. "She'll never survive the storm." But in reality, Isabella was the storm. By the end of the month, she had built a fortress of evidence, allies, and strategy. And just like her ancestors who had survived wars and economic collapses, Isabella prepared to strike not with chaos but with precision. Her silent strategy had one goal, not just to expose Adrian, but to ensure he could never rise again. Because the sweetest revenge is not noise, it's the silence that comes before the thunder. The storm did not begin with thunder. It began with a whisper. A single investigative article appeared on the front page of a respected financial paper. Blackwell Corporation under scrutiny, allegations of fraud surface. At first, readers assumed it was just another rumor. But then came the second article, and the third, each more damning than the last. Within a week, Adrian Blackwell's carefully polished empire was drowning in headlines. Every morning, new revelations splashed across screens. Offshore accounts linked to Vanessa, shell companies tied to Adrian's name, lavish gifts purchased with misappropriated funds. One exposé even published side-by-side photos of Isabella's quiet dignity and Vanessa flaunting stolen diamonds. The contrast was brutal, and the public devoured it. Talk shows dissected every detail. Anchors replayed footage of Adrian mocking Isabella, shaking their heads in disgust. Social media erupted in a frenzy. Justice for Isabella trended worldwide. Memes painted Adrian as a thief in a tuxedo, while Vanessa was branded the queen of scandal. What Adrian had once dismissed as noise now became the roaring tide that threatened to pull him under. The pressure mounted when television networks aired interviews with former employees. Tearful assistants spoke of being forced to forge documents. Accountants described being silenced when they raised concerns. Each testimony painted Adrian as not just unfaithful, but corrupt to his core. The man who had once been admired as a self-made billionaire was now exposed as a fraud propped up by greed. Meanwhile, Isabella never spoke a word publicly. She refused interviews, declined photo shoots, and issued no statements. Her silence, paired with her poised appearances at select charity events, only amplified her power. The media portrayed her as the wronged wife who chose dignity over drama, a mother-to-be who embodied grace in the face of betrayal. The contrast to Adrian's arrogance made her untouchable in the public eye. Inside his penthouse, Adrian unraveled. He screamed at Vanessa, accused journalists of conspiring, and threatened lawsuits he could never win. "They'll forget," he muttered, pacing with bloodshot eyes. "Scandals die down." But each day proved him wrong. Advertisers withdrew, investors abandoned ship, and government agencies quietly began their inquiries. For Vanessa, the storm was immediate and vicious. Paparazzi camped outside her door, hurling insults. Strangers spat at her in restaurants. A luxury brand she once promoted ran a public statement: "We condemn infidelity and fraud. Ms. Lee is no longer associated with our image." The woman who had once basked in stolen fame now hid behind drawn curtains, watching her world collapse. But the most devastating blow came during a primetime news broadcast. A respected anchor presented leaked documents, carefully curated by Isabella and her legal team, showing Adrian's personal signature authorizing fraudulent transfers. The camera zoomed in on the damning evidence as the anchor's voice cut through the silence. "This is not rumor. This is proof." The media storm was no longer just scandal. It was evidence, undeniable and unforgiving. Adrian's face, once admired, now filled screens as the embodiment of betrayal and corruption. And yet, while the world raged outside, Isabella sat in her study, hands resting on her belly, calm as the eye of the hurricane. She had not lifted her voice, yet her silence had toppled an empire. Because in the court of public opinion, Adrian had already been tried and found guilty. When the media storm peaked, it was no longer just gossip. It became a trigger for something far more dangerous: official scrutiny. What began as whispered questions from journalists turned into phone calls from federal investigators. And soon, the government could no longer ignore what the world had already seen. Adrian Blackwell was not simply unfaithful, he was criminal. It started with subpoenas. The Securities and Exchange Commission quietly issued requests for Blackwell Corporation's financial records. Then came the IRS, questioning the suspicious offshore accounts highlighted in Isabella's leaked documents. Within days, the FBI's Financial Crimes Division stepped in, their agents combing through Adrian's empire with cold precision. Adrian tried to play it cool. At board meetings, he dismissed the investigations as routine. He told Vanessa, pacing in his penthouse, "They have nothing on me. I've covered every trail." But the truth gnawed at him. He had not covered every trail. He had grown arrogant, careless, believing himself untouchable. And Isabella had turned those mistakes into a weapon. The first raid struck like lightning. Federal agents stormed one of Blackwell Corporation's satellite offices, seizing computers, ledgers, and hard drives. News cameras captured the moment as employees carried boxes past flashing lights. Adrian watched the footage on television, his glass of whiskey trembling in his hand. "It's nothing," he muttered. "They'll find nothing." But his reflection in the glass told another story. Fear. Vanessa, meanwhile, cracked under pressure. She received a summons herself, demanding testimony about her consulting fees. Reporters shouted questions as she entered the courthouse, her designer sunglasses failing to mask her panic. Once adored for her beauty, she was now branded as an accomplice. When investigators revealed bank records showing luxury cars and jewelry purchased directly with stolen funds, Vanessa fainted under the courtroom's fluorescent lights. The footage went viral before she even left the building. Adrian's allies began to vanish. Politicians he once donated to refused his calls. Business partners quietly severed contracts. Even his legal team demanded payment up front, knowing his accounts could be frozen at any moment. He stood alone, a man surrounded by glass walls cracking under the weight of truth. Meanwhile, Isabella remained silent, her strategy unfolding with ruthless grace. She attended a charity luncheon, smiled softly at cameras, and spoke only of children's education. Not once did she mention Adrian's name. Yet the contrast was devastating. While Adrian appeared on screens sweating, shouting, and denying, Isabella embodied calm resilience. Public opinion tilted further against him with each passing day. The breaking point came when agents presented Adrian with the evidence he feared most: his own signature authorizing transfers into shell corporations. The documents, verified by handwriting experts, left no room for excuses. Sitting in his lawyer's office, Adrian's facade crumbled. "This isn't possible," he whispered, hands trembling. But it was possible, because he had done it, and Isabella had made sure the world knew. The authorities were no longer circling. They were closing in. Adrian, once the untouchable billionaire, was now a man trapped in a cage of his own making. And though his fall was inevitable, Isabella had ensured it would be thorough, public, and irreversible. Because in the end, justice is not loud, it is patient, and now it was knocking on Adrian Blackwell's door. Vanessa Lee had always believed she was destined for the spotlight. For years, she convinced herself she was smarter than the other women, prettier, more deserving of the life she had stolen. When Adrian placed diamonds around her neck and whispered promises in the dark, she thought she had won. But now, with the authorities circling and the media tearing her apart, Vanessa realized she had built her empire on sand, and the tide was coming in. Her collapse began the morning she opened her front door to find eviction papers taped to it. The luxury apartment Adrian had leased in her name was under investigation, payments traced directly to fraudulent accounts. By noon, her credit cards were frozen, her cars repossessed, and her jewelry locked away as potential evidence. The glamorous life she flaunted online vanished in a single day. Reporters followed her every move, their questions merciless. "Vanessa, did you know the money was stolen? Were you Adrian's accomplice or his victim? How does it feel to lose everything?" Each word chipped at her fragile pride. She snapped once, screaming at the cameras, "You don't know me." The clip went viral within hours, branded as the meltdown of the year. Inside, Vanessa spiraled. She tried calling Adrian, but his phone went unanswered. She turned to old friends, only to find numbers disconnected or texts ignored. The women she once mocked as jealous now laughed at her downfall, whispering gleefully that she had gotten exactly what she deserved. The worst humiliation came in court. Summoned to testify about her consulting fees, Vanessa attempted to play the victim, insisting she knew nothing of Adrian's crimes. But prosecutors revealed receipts of wire transfers to her personal account, matching the dates of her lavish shopping sprees. Screens displayed images of her in the very gowns and jewels purchased with stolen funds. Gasps filled the room. Vanessa collapsed into tears, begging the judge to believe her innocence. But the damage was done. The world saw her not as a victim, but as a willing partner in corruption. Social media was relentless. Memes mocked her breakdown, labeling her fraud's Barbie. Comment sections overflowed with venom. She ruined a family. She stole from the unborn child. She thought she was clever. Now she's nothing. Each word cut deeper than the last. Isolated and disgraced, Vanessa wandered her empty apartment, the silence suffocating. She stared into mirrors that once reflected vanity, now showing only ruin. Without Adrian's money, without society's applause, without friends to cling to, she was forced to face the truth she had always buried. She was not special, not chosen, not powerful. She was disposable. The final collapse came when federal agents seized her passport, restricting her from leaving the country. Reporters captured the moment she stumbled out of the courthouse, sunglasses hiding swollen eyes, her designer dress wrinkled, her heels wobbling. The caption read, "From Mistress to Defendant." Vanessa Lee, who once reveled in stolen glory, now stood alone, stripped of everything. Because when you build your throne on another woman's pain, you should be ready to fall, and fall hard. The day Adrian Blackwell had feared finally arrived, not with whispers, but with sirens. For weeks, he had clung to denial. He told himself the investigators would find nothing, that his lawyers would bury the evidence, that his charm would bend public opinion back in his favor. But arrogance does not erase signatures, and greed always leaves a trail. The morning the FBI came for him, Adrian was standing in front of his penthouse mirror, adjusting his tie as if preparing for a board meeting. The knock at the door was not polite. It was thunder. "Federal agents, open up." Vanessa, already shattered from her own collapse, screamed from the couch. Adrian froze, his reflection staring back with wide, bloodshot eyes. He tried to steady his breath, muttering, "This isn't happening." But it was happening, and the world was about to witness it. The door burst open, and agents flooded in. Black jackets, firm voices, no hesitation. "Adrian Blackwell, "You are under arrest for securities fraud, tax evasion, and embezzlement." The words rang like a death sentence. Adrian's bravado cracked as cold steel closed around his wrists. Outside, cameras had been waiting. Somehow, the press always knew when justice would arrive. Reporters shoved microphones forward. Photographers shouted his name. Flashbulbs exploded against his pale face. The image of Adrian Blackwell, once hailed as a genius, now shackled in handcuffs, splashed across every major outlet within minutes. "Mr. Blackwell, do you deny the charges? Did you steal from the Devereux family? Isabella warned you would fall. What do you say to her now?" Adrian tried to lift his chin, tried to summon the arrogance that had carried him this far. But his voice cracked as he shouted, "It's a setup! I'm innocent." The crowd roared back with laughter, their jeers drowning his words. Vanessa, desperate and hysterical, lunged toward him, screaming, "Don't let them take you!" But agents blocked her path. She collapsed on the marble floor, sobbing as Adrian was shoved into the back of a black SUV. The mistress who once flaunted diamonds was now nothing more than background noise to his disgrace. At the Devereux mansion, Isabella watched the broadcast in silence. She sat in the study, one hand resting over her pregnant belly, her face calm. On the screen, the man who had called her disgusting was paraded in handcuffs for the world to see. Staff glanced at her nervously, unsure if she would cry. Instead, she whispered softly, almost to herself, "Justice." The arrest triggered shockwaves across Wall Street. Stocks tied to Blackwell Corporation plummeted. Partners scrambled to cut ties, announcing emergency withdrawals. Adrian's name, once spoken with respect in boardrooms, was now synonymous with fraud. Headlines screamed, "From billionaire to inmate." That night, as Adrian sat in a holding cell, stripped of his tailored suits, he replayed the chain of events. The insults, the arrogance, the mistress, the stolen money, it had all led here. For the first time there were no mirrors, no cameras he could control, no allies to spin his story, only silence, concrete walls, and the weight of his downfall. Adrian Blackwell had built his empire on betrayal. Now betrayal had delivered him to his cage. Because no matter how high you climb, if the ladder is built on lies, the fall is inevitable. The trial of Adrian Blackwell became the spectacle of the decade. Courtrooms are usually solemn places, but this one buzzed like a theater. Cameras lined the steps outside, reporters filed live updates by the hour, and the public devoured every headline. Once admired as a self-made billionaire, Adrian was now the centerpiece of America's most scandalous courtroom drama. The prosecution wasted no time painting him as a thief in a tuxedo. They laid out the evidence with surgical precision: forged contracts, offshore accounts, and transfers into Vanessa's name. Charts displayed on giant screens tracked millions siphoned from Devereux-linked investments. Each number was a nail in his coffin. Adrian sat at the defense table, suit wrinkled, eyes bloodshot, his once proud smirk replaced with a permanent scowl. He whispered furiously to his lawyers, but every time he spoke too loudly, the judge silenced him with a gavel. The man who once commanded boardrooms now struggled to command a single sentence. Vanessa was dragged in as a witness, her downfall complete. She tried to claim ignorance, tears streaming as she insisted she was in love, not in crime. But prosecutors shredded her testimony with receipts of her luxury shopping sprees. Every handbag, every diamond bracelet linked directly to Adrian's fraudulent accounts. The jury's eyes hardened with each revelation. The most devastating moment, however, came when Isabella's evidence was introduced. Her legal team presented the folder she had uncovered, the contracts, the offshore trails, the emails Adrian thought he had buried. Each page bore his unmistakable signature. Forensic experts confirmed their authenticity, and Isabella's calm testimony explained how she discovered them. She took the stand with quiet dignity. 6 months pregnant, draped in a simple navy dress, Isabella faced the courtroom not as a victim, but as a witness to truth. Her voice was steady, her words measured. Adrian Blackwell did not just betray me as a husband. He betrayed shareholders, employees, and the public trust. He believed he was untouchable. But no one is above the law. The jury listened in silence, captivated by the contrast between Isabella's poise and Adrian's unraveling. When cross-examined, she never wavered. The defense tried to paint her as vengeful, but her calm responses dismantled every attempt. By the time she stepped down, the courtroom was buzzing, not with pity, but with respect. Adrian tried to reclaim control during his testimony. He spoke of witch hunts, of jealous rivals, even of Isabella plotting against him. But his arrogance only deepened the jury's disdain. His rants, once persuasive in the corporate world, now sounded desperate and hollow. Closing arguments sealed his fate. The prosecution declared, "This is not the story of a genius undone by bad luck. This is the story of a man who built an empire on lies and thought he could escape justice. Today, we prove he cannot." The jury deliberated for less than a day. When they returned, the foreperson read the verdict, "Guilty on all counts." The words echoed like thunder. Adrian's shoulders slumped, his face pale, his empire officially reduced to rubble. Outside the courthouse, Isabella emerged to a wall of cameras. She did not gloat, did not smile. She placed a protective hand on her belly and said only one sentence: "Justice has spoken." Adrian Blackwell's trial was over. His punishment, however, was only beginning. The trial had ended, but the world held its breath for one final moment: the sentencing. On the morning of the hearing, the courthouse steps swarmed with reporters. Cameramen jostled for position, anchors rehearsed lines, and the crowd buzzed with anticipation. It wasn't just about justice anymore, it was about spectacle. People wanted to see Adrian Blackwell, the man who once dined with presidents, reduced to a number in a prison system. Inside the courtroom, tension hung thick. The judge entered, gavel in hand, her face stern. Adrian sat at the defense table, pale and gaunt, his tailored suit replaced by one that hung loose on his frame. The arrogance that once defined him had evaporated. Even Vanessa, seated on the opposite bench awaiting her own fate, avoided his eyes. The prosecutor spoke first, outlining the devastation Adrian had caused. This man siphoned millions, defrauded investors, and used stolen funds to support his mistress. He mocked his pregnant wife in public while orchestrating one of the most callous financial schemes in recent memory. His actions were not mistakes, they were choices, calculated, deliberate, and fueled by greed. Then came Adrian's lawyer, pleading for leniency. "My client has already suffered public humiliation. He has lost his company, his wealth, and his reputation. Prison should be rehabilitation, not destruction." But when Adrian was invited to speak, he couldn't help himself. He rose shakily, his voice hoarse but still dripping with arrogance. "This is a witch hunt. I built everything with my own hands. Isabella and her family plotted this. They couldn't stand that I was more powerful than them." His rant drew murmurs from the gallery. Even the judge's expression hardened. Finally, the judge delivered her ruling. Her words were steady, each one a blow. "Adrian Blackwell, you stand convicted of securities fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion. You abused trust, exploited love, and mocked justice. You believed yourself untouchable. Today, the law reminds you otherwise." She paused, the courtroom silent. "You are hereby sentenced to 30 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 20. You will also forfeit all misappropriated funds and assets." Gasps echoed. Adrian's knees buckled, his hands trembling as guards stepped forward. For a man who once ruled boardrooms, the clang of handcuffs was deafening. Vanessa's turn followed swiftly. The judge addressed her coldly. "Miss Lee, though not the architect, you were a willing accomplice. You benefited from stolen money, flaunted it, and aided in covering his crimes. The law cannot ignore that." Vanessa sobbed as the sentence was read. 5 years in prison, reduced to 3 with good behavior. The mistress who once dripped in diamonds collapsed into her lawyer's arms, wailing as if the world had ended. For her, it had. Meanwhile, Isabella sat quietly in the gallery, her hand resting on her belly. She did not smile, did not clap, did not show triumph, but a single tear rolled down her cheek, not for Adrian, but for the years she had lost believing in him. She whispered, barely audible, "It's over." Outside, the world erupted. Headlines screamed, "Blackwell sentenced to 30 years, Mistress faces prison, and justice for Isabella." Crowds cheered as the once untouchable titan was led away in shackles. For Adrian, the prison gates marked the end. For Isabella, they marked a beginning. Because justice is not just a sentence, it is freedom for the one who was betrayed. For the first time in years, the Devereux mansion felt like a sanctuary again. The echoes of betrayal had faded, replaced by the soft lullabies of new life. Isabella cradled her newborn son in her arms, the weight of him both delicate and infinite. His tiny fingers curled around hers, and she felt a rush of purpose stronger than any empire. The trial, the sentencing, the humiliation, all of it was behind her now. Adrian was locked away, Vanessa disgraced, and the storm that once threatened to consume her had passed. What remained was healing. In the weeks after her child's birth, Isabella embraced motherhood with a calm fierceness. She spent long nights rocking him in the nursery once left unfinished, now glowing with warmth. The walls were painted a soft cream, stars dangled above the crib, and the air was filled with the scent of lavender. Each time her son stirred, Isabella whispered, "You will never grow up in shadows. You will know dignity, love, and strength." But healing did not mean retreat. Isabella knew her life was no longer just about survival. It was about reclaiming what was hers. With Alexander's encouragement, she stepped back into the world of business. This time not as Adrian's silent wife, but as the Devereux heiress in her own right. Boardrooms that once dismissed her now fell silent when she spoke. Investors leaned in, captivated by her vision. She proposed initiatives rooted in integrity, transparency, and responsibility. Within months, she not only restored the family's reputation, but expanded its influence. Where Adrian had built on lies, Isabella rebuilt on truth. Her strength rippled beyond finance. Isabella launched a foundation for women who had endured betrayal, humiliation, or domestic cruelty. She funded scholarships, shelters, and legal aid programs. At the ribbon-cutting ceremony, she stood before a crowd, her son in her arms, and declared, "A woman's worth is never defined by the man who betrays her. We are stronger than our scars." The applause was thunderous, but it was the tears of women in the audience that mattered most to her. Healing also came in small moments. Walks in the garden where she had once wept now filled her with peace. Dinners with her family, once strained by Adrian's shadow, were now warm and filled with laughter. Evenings once haunted by loneliness were now alive with the gentle breathing of her child beside her. The public, too, transformed in how they saw her. No longer the fat wife mocked at galas, Isabella became a symbol of resilience. Magazines featured her not for scandal but for leadership. Headlines read, "From betrayed to beloved, the heiress who rose again." Her story became a beacon of hope for anyone who had ever been underestimated. Isabella's triumph was not loud. It was not about gloating or revenge. It was in the quiet confidence with which she walked into a room, the steady way she held her son, the compassion she extended to others. She had risen not by crushing those who hurt her, but by choosing to live fully, with dignity. Adrian was forgotten by many, a name tied to disgrace. Vanessa was a cautionary tale. But Isabella was remembered as something else entirely, a woman who endured, who transformed pain into power, and who showed the world that strength often comes wrapped in silence until it is ready to roar. Because true triumph is not revenge, it is living a life so radiant that no betrayal can dim it. Years after the scandal, the name Adrian Blackwell had faded from society's lips. In prison, he was just another inmate, his empire dissolved, his power stripped. Vanessa, released early but disgraced forever, lived in obscurity, a cautionary tale whispered in circles she once dreamed of ruling. But Isabella's story endured. Her healing had become transformation, and her transformation had become legacy. On the anniversary of her foundation's launch, Isabella stood before a packed auditorium, her son now a toddler seated in the front row, his wide eyes fixed on her. The event was broadcast worldwide, and millions tuned in, eager to hear the woman who had turned betrayal into power. She began not with anger, but with honesty. "There was a time," she said, her voice steady, "when I believed silence was strength. I thought enduring cruelty meant I was loyal. I thought hiding my pain meant I was dignified. But silence nearly destroyed me. What saved me was truth. Truth I refused to ignore, truth I chose to speak, and truth I built my life upon." The room was silent, every ear straining to catch her words. She continued, her hand resting over her heart. "I was mocked for my body. I was betrayed for my trust. I was abandoned when I carried life inside me, but I was never broken. Because strength is not in how you are seen, it is in how you rise when no one believes you can." Applause thundered, but Isabella raised a hand, quieting the room. She looked directly into the cameras, speaking not just to the audience before her, but to every woman, every man, every person watching from their living rooms. "This is not just my story, it is yours too. You may be underestimated, betrayed, mocked, or discarded, but you are not defined by the ones who hurt you. You are defined by how you choose to rise. I rose for my son, I rose for myself, and tonight I ask you, rise for your future." Her words struck like lightning, igniting a wave of emotion across the auditorium. Tears streamed down faces. Strangers clasped hands, and applause erupted again, louder, longer, unstoppable. In that moment, Isabella was no longer just a woman who had survived betrayal. She was a symbol, a beacon of resilience, and a voice for those still in silence. As the event ended, Isabella descended from the stage, her son running into her arms. She lifted him high, his laughter filling the hall, a sound purer than any applause. Photographers captured the image, and by morning it was splashed across every front page. Isabella, triumphant, holding the child who represented her future. Back at the mansion that night, she tucked her son into bed and stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker against the Hudson River. Once, she had looked out this same window, broken and humiliated. Now she stood taller, her reflection glowing with peace. She whispered into the quiet night, "We won, not by destroying, but by rebuilding, not with hate, but with strength." Isabella Devereux Blackwell's journey was complete, not because her enemies had fallen, but because she had risen higher than they ever dreamed. Because in the end, the greatest revenge is not punishment. It is living a life so radiant, so dignified, that no betrayal can touch it. So that's it, my friends. The story has finally come to a close. And if you're still here with me right now, I know something in Isabella's journey has touched your heart in a real way. Maybe it's her courage, maybe it's her strength, or maybe it's the reminder that no betrayal can ever define who we are. The Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." That's exactly what Isabella discovered. She couldn't control Adrian's cruelty or the gossip of the world, but she could control how she chose to rise. And in doing so, she found healing, dignity, and freedom. Life will always test us. We'll face heartbreak and humiliation or disappointment. But as this teaches, it is not the event itself that breaks us. It is how we choose to respond. Choose courage. Choose resilience. Choose to rise. If this story moved you, please give it a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight, and don't forget to subscribe. Because here, we tell stories that remind us, no matter the pain, we are always stronger than we think. The ballroom pulsed with light, crystal chandeliers spilling gold across gowns worth more than most homes. Adrian Blackwell, the man who had risen from nothing into a billionaire, stood smugly at the center. His hand rested on the waist of Vanessa Lee, a woman half his wife's size and twice as eager to flaunt her stolen crown. Their laughter rang out, sharp and cruel, like knives thrown into the air. And then came the words that froze a waiter mid-step and made 3 guests glance away in pity. Adrian leaned close to Vanessa's ear, his voice not as low as he believed. "That fat woman disgusts me," he sneered, lips curling into the kind of smile only arrogance can wear. Vanessa giggled, her crimson dress shimmering under the chandelier as though celebrating the cruelty. But what Adrian did not know was that his words had found ears beyond his mistress. A journalist lingering nearby lifted a brow, his recorder accidentally catching every syllable. Whispers stirred at the edges of the room, moving like smoke, ready to ignite into fire. And then, like fate had been waiting for its cue, the grand doors opened. Silence poured over the crowd like ice water. A limousine outside still gleamed with raindrops as its passengers stepped inside the ballroom. Isabella Blackwell, 6 months pregnant, carrying the child Adrian had once claimed to want, stood tall. Her gown, silk the color of midnight, swept across the floor. Diamonds glistened on her neck, but none shone brighter than the steel in her eyes. Gasps erupted. Guests who had pitied her now scrambled to stand straighter. And most damning of all, beside her, offering his arm like a silent protector, was Alexander Devereux, the elusive CEO and her blood relative, whose power rivaled Adrian's empire. Adrian's smirk faltered. Vanessa's hand tightened on his arm, her painted smile wobbling. The cameras flashed one after another, capturing the moment that would define the scandal. The scorned fat wife, no longer hidden, no longer small, walking into the lion's den with the force of her lineage at her back. The man who mocked her thought tonight was his coronation. Instead, it was the beginning of his collapse. Isabella Devereux Blackwell was not born to be ordinary. She was the only daughter of the Devereux family, a dynasty whose name echoed through banks, real estate, and international politics. Her childhood was carved in marble hallways, her education sculpted by the finest tutors in Europe, and her character forged not in luxury, but in expectation. Everyone thought she would inherit the empire. Yet love, or what she believed was love, changed her course. Adrian Blackwell had entered her life like a storm disguised as sunshine. He was charming, ambitious, and clever enough to make even her shrewd father pause. To her, he was proof that sincerity still existed beyond power and titles. To Adrian, she was a golden key, the door to everything he dreamed of, but could never reach on his own. Their wedding had been a spectacle of fairy tales. Roses lining cathedral steps, reporters crying out her name, the billionaire heiress surrendering her crown to stand beside a man who had once been nobody. And for years, Isabella played the role society expected of her. She became the devoted wife. She pulled back from boardrooms, handing Adrian the spotlight he craved. She silenced her instincts when his late-night meetings piled up. She endured cruel whispers about her weight after pregnancy shifted her figure, telling herself it was temporary, that he would see the woman who had once dazzled him. But life had other plans. At 34, Isabella was 6 months pregnant again. This child was supposed to heal the fractures she felt, but could not name. Instead, her swelling belly became ammunition for Adrian's disdain. He began to speak of her as though she were not a person but a burden, mocking her softness, dismissing her sacrifices. What wounded her most was not the insult to her body, but the betrayal of their vows. Despite it all, Isabella remained outwardly gentle. Staff whispered about her kindness, how she remembered birthdays, how she insisted the gardener's daughter receive a scholarship. To the world, she seemed naive, too tender for the brutal corridors of wealth. Yet beneath her silence lived a woman who had studied law at Oxford, who had interned at the World Bank, who knew exactly how fortunes could be built and destroyed. Her family saw both sides. Her brother Alexander, often cold and reserved, never doubted her intelligence, but he resented her choice of Adrian. When Adrian's arrogance grew, Alexander warned, "One day he will turn that hunger on you." Isabella dismissed it then, blinded by loyalty. Now, carrying her unborn child and bearing the sting of Adrian's cruel words, she remembered those warnings with painful clarity. And yet, she did not crumble. That night at the gala, when Adrian paraded his mistress under chandeliers, Isabella chose not to hide in shame. She walked in because she knew something he did not. Power could sleep, but it never disappeared. The Devereux blood in her veins carried centuries of survival. As cameras flashed and murmurs filled the ballroom, Isabella smiled faintly, her hand resting over her stomach. It was not just a gesture of protection, it was a promise. For her unborn child, she would not remain silent. For every woman mocked, dismissed, or betrayed, she would not bow. Adrian thought he had married a key. What he failed to realize was that Isabella was the lock, the gatekeeper, and the fortress. And the fortress had finally decided to awaken. The Devereux mansion was no ordinary home. It was a fortress of glass and steel standing over the Hudson River, a symbol of old money reimagined through modern power. Its marble pillars had hosted presidents, its gardens had entertained royals, and its halls carried secrets whispered over centuries. This was where Isabella had grown up, where every portrait reminded her of the weight of her bloodline. And it was here, behind gilded doors, that Adrian Blackwell had first been welcomed as a son-in-law. To Adrian, the mansion had been paradise. He remembered the first time he crossed its threshold. Red carpets rolling beneath his shoes, servants bowing their heads, the scent of lilies filling the grand foyer. To him, it was confirmation that he had made it, that he had transformed from a boy in a cramped apartment to a man who dined under crystal chandeliers. He told himself it was love, but deep inside, he knew it was conquest. In these same halls, Isabella's life had narrowed. The woman who once spoke at international forums now sat quietly in libraries, reading to soothe her unborn child. Every corner carried echoes of her sacrifices. The dining hall, where Adrian once held her hand beneath the table, now showcased him at the head, glass raised to toast his triumphs while she faded into the background. The study, once her sanctuary for research, now held Adrian's trophies and Vanessa's perfume lingering in the air after business meetings. Yet the mansion was not just a backdrop of betrayal. It was also the stage of reckoning. The Devereux family used it as headquarters for their empire. Every week, Alexander gathered the board in the East Wing, beneath towering oil paintings of ancestors who had survived wars and economic crashes. It was a room designed to remind outsiders, no matter how much you thought you owned, the Devereux legacy could swallow you whole. Adrian often strutted through that room with confidence, shaking hands with politicians and investors, pretending the weight of the Devereux dynasty was his to command. But the truth was, every piece of paper that granted him power had Isabella's name etched into it. She had never flaunted it, never used it against him, until now. Outside the mansion, New York itself was another stage. Skyscrapers mirrored each other like endless chessboards, each tower holding rivals who waited for one wrong move. The gala halls, the boardrooms, the penthouse suites, all were part of the glittering battlefield where Adrian paraded Vanessa. They thought Isabella would never step foot into those arenas again, that her silence meant defeat. But the night she arrived in a limousine, the entire city became the setting of her return. Cameras flashed not just in ballrooms but in the streets, tabloids raced to print covers before midnight, and social media flooded with hashtags, "The real Mrs. Blackwell, Heiress returns, Adrian's fall." In a world where reputation meant currency, Isabella's reappearance was not merely symbolic, it was financial warfare. Back at the mansion as dawn crept through the windows after the gala, Isabella sat in her childhood bedroom. The nursery next door was half prepared. Soft cream walls, a crib waiting to be built, a mobile of stars hanging silent. She traced her hand over her belly and looked out at the skyline. This house had seen her as a daughter, a wife, a shadow. Soon, it would see her as something more, the woman who would reclaim not only her dignity but also the empire. The mansion, the city, the ballrooms, they were no longer Adrian's playground. They were Isabella's battlefield. And she was ready to fight on every stage he thought he owned. Adrian Blackwell was the kind of man who looked like he had been sculpted for magazine covers. Sharp jawline, tailored suits, and a smile that had once fooled an heiress into believing in him. But beneath the polish lived hunger. A hunger so deep it ate through vows, family, and decency. He was the villain not because he was poor once, but because he believed power excused cruelty. He had grown up watching his mother clip coupons and his father drown in debt. Adrian swore that one day he would never beg again. When he met Isabella Devereux, he saw not just a woman, but a ladder. He wrapped his ambition in charm, convinced her he loved her, and when the Devereux family opened their gates, he climbed without hesitation. To the world, he was a success story. To Isabella, he was once a husband. But in truth, he had always been a wolf dressed as a savior. As the years passed, Adrian's arrogance expanded with his fortune. He began to rewrite history in his own mind, convincing himself that his brilliance, not Isabella's family, had built his empire. His board meetings turned into theater shows, where he barked orders and mocked those beneath him. Behind closed doors, he compared Isabella to Vanessa with words sharper than knives. "A wife should elevate a man," he sneered one evening, not realizing a servant overheard. "Instead, she drags me down with her weight and her silence." Vanessa Lee, the mistress, was no innocent either. At 26, she had perfected the art of appearing fragile while scheming like a veteran. She laughed at Adrian's jokes, fed his ego, and whispered promises of freedom from his burdens. She wore designer dresses he bought with money traced back to Devereux accounts, and she relished the attention of being seen on his arm. To her, Isabella was an obstacle, and she mocked her openly in private parties, calling her the whale in pearls. Together, Adrian and Vanessa were poison disguised as champagne. They flaunted their affair at galas, daring anyone to question them. Adrian told himself he deserved happiness after years of sacrifice, and Vanessa told herself she deserved the lifestyle after years of being overlooked. In their reflections, they were heroes of their own stories. In truth, they were parasites feeding on the same woman's kindness. But villains always reveal themselves. Adrian's cruelty wasn't just personal, it was professional. He funneled money through offshore accounts, forged signatures, and silenced whistleblowers. Vanessa helped launder his sins, signing papers without hesitation, smiling in photographs to distract from the stench of corruption. They believed their secrets were locked away. They never imagined the same heiress they mocked would be the one to expose them. The night Adrian told Vanessa, "That fat woman disgusts me," he thought it was the final nail in Isabella's coffin. What he didn't realize was that it was the beginning of his own downfall. Every sneer, every insult, every dollar stolen, it was fuel waiting for the spark Isabella would strike. In the world of wealth, villains do not wear masks. They wear tuxedos, drink champagne, and laugh under chandeliers. Adrian and Vanessa thought they were untouchable. But as history had shown, villains who rise on betrayal always fall harder than they ever dreamed.